started. Good morning on this Thanksgiving Tuesday. For the lucky few that are still on campus. I'm happy to welcome and introduce Yue Li from The Ohio State University. So we were able to connect a little bit about that last night. She's one of our visiting job candidates for assistant professor position, and without further ado, Yue, go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Dr. Rasmussen, for the introduction. It's my great honor today to share some of my work with you all. So I've been very interested in computational social science methods. So today I'm going to share some of my work using computational social science methods with you. So before I talk about the main content for today, I'd like to talk a little bit about myself. I'm a fifth-year PhD candidate at The Ohio State University, and I'm working on finishing my dissertation there. But before I came back to school, I worked as a research executive for Kantar, which is Kantar Millward Brown, which is a marketing research agency under WPP. So this is the office building in Shanghai where I worked for 2 years. And this little shell, this is my office, actually. So at Kantar, I was responsible for assessing advertising effectiveness, tracking brand health, and evaluating integrated marketing communication campaigns. So I enjoyed running well-established models there, but then I was always asking myself, like, how can we scale up those studies, and then how to get insights using large-scale social media data? So that's the reason why, or the initial intention for me to come back to school. My PhD program actually provides much more than that. I learned not only the analytical skills, but also theoretical perspectives to see the world. So a lot of my research uses theory-driven computational research methods to explain communication processes. So computational social science methods can easily go data-driven, but then I use communication theories to guide every step of my research. For the computational methods, I mainly use network analysis, natural language processing, and machine learning to analyze big data, which typically include network data, text data, and digital trace data. And a lot of computational methods, computational work is descriptive in nature. So descriptive works are valuable. I use my work based on those descriptive works, but I focus on the analytical, the inferential part. So I use advanced inferential analysis to explain communication phenomena. So those advanced inferential analysis include inferential network analysis, longitudinal analysis of panel data, and time series analysis. For communication processes, my current research program focuses on the delivery, diffusion, processing, and impacts of health-related information and misinformation. So specifically, my research program addresses how news media and governments deliver public health policies. How does those health-related information and misinformation diffuse on social media platforms? How do individuals process health-related information and misinformation? And finally, what kind of effects those strategic communication of health information have on behavior, on attitudes and behaviors? So in today's presentation, I'm going to present 2 studies to demonstrate my approaches to examining the diffusion, delivery, processing, and impacts of health-related information using computational approaches. So the first study combines natural language processing and inferential network analysis to examine the diffusion of the mask policy across news media on 2 social media platforms, Facebook and Twitter. So this study was originally the final project of a network analysis class, and then it was recently published in Human Communication Research. The other study I'm going to present today combines machine learning and time series analysis to examine the delivery and processing of the public health policies during the initial stage of the COVID-19 pandemic. This study is currently under the 3rd round of review in Human Communication Research. So let's get started from the first study, which is about the news coverage of the mask policy. So before we get into the details of this study, let me show you some examples of how news media report or cover the mask policy on May 21st, 2020. So on that day, Trump visited Ford in Michigan without wearing a mask. But news media reported this event from different angles. So for example, some news media focused on the relationship between Trump and news media. So like HuffPost, it said like Trump refuses to wear the mask for the public part of the tour to spite reporters. And then Axios also focuses on the relationship between Trump and the news media, said, oh, he declined to wear a mask to avoid giving the press the pleasure. Some news media focused on the policy side of this event, like these two headlines from Fox News and Forbes. Right, so like Michigan AG tells Trump to wear a mask while visiting the Ford plant. It's the law. And the Forbes said similar things. The president is like a petulant child. Michigan AG rips Trump for not wearing face mask. So from these examples, we know that different news media cover the same event from totally different angles, which results in different levels of text similarity. So what I just showed you are dyadic level text similarity between two news organizations. This dyadic level text similarity may evolve into network level phenomenon, which we call news polarization. So news polarization refers to the semantic similarity within and semantic divergence between groups of news media with similar attributes, such as media ideology. Though diversified opinions are beneficial to democracy, news polarization may have negative impacts on the society, such as a lack of common understanding surrounding some important social and political issues, such as the pandemic, which may lead to a divided society. So an important question to ask about news polarization is, what causes news polarization? So we adopted a multi-theoretical, multi-level, multi-dimensional network model proposed by Oksanova and Munch in 2013 to examine the factors that may cause news polarization from the news organization side and the news audience side. So we relied on multiple theories. So all these theories are actually mapped onto this little figure. And then we use multiple theories to generate our hypothesis. And then we conducted analysis at the node level, dyad level, and network level. And finally, we analyzed the three dimensions all at the same time. So the three dimensions are news content dimension, news organization dimension, and news audience dimension. So in this network model, we have three dimensions, like I just mentioned. And I'll explain later like how each of these can be considered as a network. So the connections between these dimensions or sectors are also considered as networks, like the news organization, the network between news organizations and news content, the network between news audience and news content. So the original model has nine networks. In this study, we focused on 4 networks: the news content network, the news organizations network, the network between news organizations and news content, and the network between news audience and news content. So these 4 networks are in solid lines in this little figure. So the first network is within the news content sector. So Bale used cultural networks to refer to this type of network. In the upper figure, this hypothetical example here, we have 2 types of nodes. The rectangles here represent news media. The circles here represent the words used by news media. So in this hypothetical example, CNN and Fox News has one common word, which is covering. CNN and New York Times have two common words, which are mask and covering. So in this hypothetical example, the text similarity between CNN and New York Times is higher than the text similarity between CNN and Fox News. So if we collapse this network in the upper figure into the network in the lower figure, then we get this cultural network. So in this network, we only have one type of nodes, which are news media or news organizations. And the edges between those nodes represent the text similarities. So the thicker the lines are, or the edges are, the more similar news content generated by the news media here. So the next network is within the news organizations network, this sector. So this type of network is based on the similarities in terms of media ideology and news truthfulness. So imagine that we have two continuums. One continuum is about media ideology. The other continuum is about news truthfulness. So we can map all news media onto these two continuums. For example, this one, like Fox News is more on the conservative side, MSNBC is more on the liberal side, but AP is more on the at the neutral position. So the closer the news media are on this continuum, the more similar they are in terms of media ideology. If we transform this continuum into the network, then here the nodes again represent news media, and the edges represent the similarities in terms of media ideology. So the more similar the news media are in terms of media ideology, the thicker the lines are. So I have talked about the network within the news organization sector and the network within the news content sector. These two sectors are connected or related. So in this slide, I'm going to talk about how we can use news organizations network to predict the network within the news content sector. So in other words, the more similar the news media are in terms of media ideology and news truthfulness, the more similar the news content are, generated by this news media. This is because news content is a product or the reflection of the news media, of the news media's attributes such as political ideology and economic interest of its editors, etc. So the more similar the news media are in these attributes, the more likely the news articles are semantically similar. So this is actually the most important contribution of this study. So instead of focusing on one individual level attributes of news media, we focused on the networks or connections between news media. Instead of focusing on the one single news article, we focus on the semantic similarities between news articles. So we kind of changed shifts the focus of mass communication from individual level attributes to network level connections. Now for the news audience, this news audience sector, since we don't have social network data, like individual level social network data, we use the aggregated previous days social media engagement on Facebook and Twitter to predict the next day or the current day cultural network within the news content sector. So news media would like to get public attention on their news articles such that they can sell the public attention to advertisers to attract, to gain profit, make money. So that's we predicted that news media, news audience will also play a role in the news generation processes. This is actually the second most important theoretical contribution of this study. So by examining how news media, how news audience can play a role in news content generation processes, we kind of challenge the traditional mass communication theories, such as agenda setting and gatekeeping, which assumes that news media will set the agenda, keep the gate for the audience, but not vice versa. Now, I hope I have convinced you that the network approach is a very useful approach to examine news media system. Next, I'm going to show you how empirically we use data to test these relationships that I just talked about. So first, we use the NewsWhip API to collect 5,000 news articles per day that received the most engagement on Twitter and Facebook. And then we filtered news articles that contain the keyword mask from March 2020 to December 2020. So from this step, we collected monthly social engagement data and the raw text data, so the data on these two sectors. So in total, we collected more than 20,000 news articles from more than 100 news media in 10 months on Facebook and Twitter. Next, we rely on the Media Bias Fact Check, which is a third-party independent organization to classify news media in terms of their media ideology and the news truthfulness. So this step actually collected data for the news organization sector. Then we use TextNets, a package in R, to create temporal cultural networks. That is one cultural network per month. This helps us test the relationship involving time, such as effects of social media engagement on the previous day on the current day, the current cultural network. For the descriptive analysis, we calculated modularity, which is a network measure to examine the extent of news polarization. Finally, for the inferential analysis, we applied the network or dynamic, additive, and multiplicative effects model to test the relationships between news audience, news organizations, and news content. So this is a very complex model actually, but you can think about it as a network version, longitudinal regression model. But then this model takes into account all the interdependencies between news media and all the interdependencies between news articles. So before presenting the quantitative results, I would like to show you how the cultural networks would look like the cultural networks and their relationships with media ideology and news truthfulness. So here, the nodes represent news media, and the edges represent text similarities. The color here represent media ideology. So red or reddish colors represent conservative, and then blue and bluish colors represent liberal. So as you can see in the figure, news media with similar colors tend to cluster together. In other words, news media with similar ideologies tend to generate similar news content. This is just based on the visuals, we find this pattern. Now, news truthfulness influences news polarization in a similar way. So here, the nodes also represent news media. The edges also represent text similarity, but the colors here represent news truthfulness. So green or greenish colors represent high news truthfulness, but then red or reddish colors represent low news truthfulness. So we find similar patterns here. Nodes with similar colors tend to cluster together, or in other words, news with similar levels of news truthfulness tend to generate similar news content. So here are the results of the inferential analysis using the dynamic, additive, and multiplicative network model. So here the dependent variable is the semantic similarities between news media. The key independent variables are dyad level, media ideology, and news truthfulness, and the node level, media ideology, and news truthfulness. The reason why we have similar independent variable here is because we have multi-level analysis. So dyad level and node level are separated. So exactly like what we predicted and what we just see in those figures, dyad level, media ideology, and news truthfulness are significant predictors of cultural networks or text similarities, but not node level, media ideology and news truthfulness. So this means that similarities between news media in terms of ideology and news truthfulness predicted the semantic similarities, but not media ideology and news truthfulness per se. Again, this is the first or the most important contribution of this study, network level, networks of news organizations influence networks of news content, not the media ideology or the news truthfulness per se. So another important independent variable is the lag 1 public engagement or social media engagement on social media, on Facebook and Twitter. So social media engagement in the previous month is a significant predictor of the news text similarity between news in the next month. Again, this results means that news audience indeed indirectly participate in the agenda setting and gatekeeping processes, which challenges the assumption of traditional mass communication theories like agenda setting and gatekeeping. So to wrap up, this study shows 3 potential processes that may influence news polarization through a network lens. Theoretically, this study shifts the focus of mass communication from individual attributes to network connections or relational structures. This study also challenges traditional mass communication theories such as agenda setting and gatekeeping. And methodologically, this study demonstrates how to combine natural language processing and inferential network analysis to answer theoretically interesting questions. And as I mentioned, this study, we don't have individual level social network data, so we cannot examine how news content diffuses across individuals on social media. So future studies, we may want to examine how health-related information diffuses across individuals on social media. This is exactly what the first study of my dissertation will do. So far I have talked about the first study, which demonstrates how to use natural language processing and inferential analysis to examine the diffusion of health-related information across news media on social media platforms. So in the next study, I'm going to talk about how to combine machine learning and time series analysis to examine the delivery and processing of health policies during the early stage of the pandemic. So this study is about presidential communication and self-quarantine behavior. So lots of empirical studies have found that there is a partisan gap in the perceptions and behaviors related to COVID-19 during the early stage of the pandemic, from perceptions of threats to attitudes towards vaccine. And even for hand washing, partisans started showing different or distinct behaviors. So study 2 aims to figure out the reason or the mechanisms and then find ways to reduce polarization. So a natural question to ask is, what drives partisan divide in a public health crisis or issue? So many factors can influence the partisan divide, like the existing attitudes towards science, the residential places people live in, or like news diet, etc. So one important factor that is less studied but important is presidential communication. Strategic presidential communication is important because it can help unite people. This is particularly true when the public is less informed or less certain about certain issues, such as a pandemic. So presidential communication has many forms, such as major addresses and also press conferences. So here we focused on press conferences because press conferences were most frequently used during the early stage of the pandemic in the US. So however, empirical findings on whether and how presidential communication will shape or change public opinions is mixed. So part of the reason behind this mixed findings is that the nature or the features of presidential communication is less clear. So, but our communication literature provides rich theories to study message features, including, I will explain later what do I mean by message features here. But then our communication literature actually can fill this gap using our existing communication theories. So I have talked about presidential communication, but to examine the effects of presidential communication on the public, we also need to consider the factors on the audience side, on the public side. So party identity, which is a type of social identity, will influence how people process information from presidential communication. So how to connect message features from the presidential communication side and the individual differences on the audience side? We rely on the extended parallel processing model to link message features with responses from the partisans. The extended parallel processing model, a well-established health communication model, provides a useful framework to link message features on the sources side and the individual's information processing on the receiver side. So a brief introduction to the EPPM. The EPPM predicts that protection motivation will lead to adaptive behaviors, whereas defensive motivation will lead to maladaptive behaviors. To evoke protection motivation, people need to perceive comparatively high levels of threat and efficacy. In order to have certain levels of threat and efficacy, message features or messages in general need to have corresponding efficacy components and threat components. However, the EPPM needs to be extended to include both micro-level and macro-level features to be applied to the COVID-19 pandemic. It is because the pandemic influences not only individual level health outcomes, but also the societal level, like financial or economic aspects of our lives. And also the pandemic requires not only individuals' efforts, but also the governmental or the organizational efforts. So therefore, we added organizational efficacy, complements to individuals and organizations, and also economic threats to this framework. And then we combine some of them and come up with the final framework to measure the message components or the message features of presidential communication. So this is our first contribution to the EPPM. We kind of extended the EPPM from just the micro level to include both micro level and macro level message features. Our second contribution to the EPPM framework is that we extended from static to dynamic to capture the asymmetric temporal effects and self-continuity effects of threat and efficacy component or threat and efficacy information. So this is very complex, and for the sake of time, I'm not gonna explain it in detail in my presentation today, but I'm happy to talk about it in the Q&A session and also any one-on-one meetings. So this first study, to examine the effects of presidential communication on public opinion, we conducted 2 studies. The first study actually focuses on the message features. So specifically, whether the White House delivers the message or the message features about threats and efficacy in a balanced way, as suggested by the EPPM. The second study combines the message features from study 1 with longitudinal surveys to examine whether and how threat information and efficacy information have different effects on people with different party identities, which reduces or widens the partisan gap in House-related perceptions and behaviors. So for the first study, which is about the message features, we first scraped White House briefings from their official website from February 2020 to July 2020. And then we break these White House briefings into sentences for the second step of this study. The second step, we take the sentences from the first step and then develop the code book guided by the EPPM. Then I worked with undergraduate students to code 10% of the randomly selected sentences. And then after we achieve high intercoder reliability, we use this coded sentences as a training data set for the next step. The next step, we used supervised machine learning models. And then the coded sentences from the second step serve as a training data set for the supervised machine learning models. And then the well-trained or the high-performed supervised machine learning models were used to predict the categories of the uncoded sentences of the White House briefings. So that's about the first study. For the second study, as I mentioned, we used longitudinal surveys conducted by Ipsos, which is a survey company, from March 2020 to August 2020. So we have like 21 waves in total. Then we matched the scaled up finding from study 1 with the longitudinal surveys at the population level, not the individual level, but population level by date. For the inferential analysis, we applied time series models to the message components and also to the behavioral components respectively. So just to refresh your mind, for study 1, we were interested in whether the White House delivered the threat information and efficacy information in a balanced way. So research question 1 here asked, did the White House or whether the White House press conferences communicate threat information and efficacy information in a balanced way, as suggested by the EPPM? So based on this descriptive results, we can know that threat information was not talked a lot in the White House briefings, but efficacy information, especially response efficacy, was emphasized during those press conferences. So research question 2 asked whether this kind of pattern, this imbalanced pattern, exists over time. So we found that these are the results of the time series models. So we found that increasing 1 word about threat on the previous day will increase half a word about threat and almost 4 words about response efficacy on the next day. So in other words, like this unbalanced pattern exists. It also kept enlarging the gap between threat information and efficacy information in the White House briefings. So study 2 actually examines whether and how the unbalanced threat and efficacy information from the White House briefings will influence the perceptions and behaviors of Democrats and Republicans respectively, and whether and how threat information and efficacy information will reduce or widen the partisan gap. So we have a range of interesting dependent variables such as perceived threat, perceived efficacy, and also self-quarantine behaviors. But also for the sake of time, I will focus on perceived threat in my presentation today. So based on the existing literature, we know that the assumption here is that Democrats already had high levels of perceived threat, whereas Republicans had relatively low levels of perceived threat at the beginning of the pandemic. Then the strategy for the White House to kind of reduce the gap, the partisan gap, should be increasing the perceived threat among Republicans. That's because Republicans were more likely to watch the White House press conferences than Democrats, and also Republicans trusted Trump's administration more than Democrats. So we predicted here that the threat information from the White House briefings might increase the perceived threat among Republicans, which reduces the partisan gap between Republicans and Democrats in perceived threat. On the other hand, for Democrats, since the anchoring point is that Trump's administration didn't handle the COVID-19 well, so excessive efficacy information from the White House press briefings would make them think that, oh, the information is not true. So they may, the information is not accurate, the information is not true, which in turn may increase their perceived threat of COVID-19 pandemic. So we predicted here that efficacy information from the White House increased the perceived threat among Democrats, which widens the partisan gap in perceived threat. So here are the results of the time series models. So the dependent variables here are the perceived threat among Republicans, Democrats, and the gap between Republicans and Democrats. So all the numbers here are percentages. So the percentages of Republicans who perceive some levels of perceived threat. And the independent variables are the message features, as well as some perceptions and behaviors on the previous day as well. So as we can see here, 1,000 words about threat from the White House briefings on the previous day will lead to 1.4% increase in Republicans who perceived threat, and 1,000 words about self-efficacy on the previous day would lead to 2% increase in Democrats who perceived some levels of perceived threat. So this is exactly consistent with what we predicted. The results basically show that our hypotheses were supported. However, recall that the White House delivered more efficacy than threat in their press conferences. So the effects of threat information on reducing partisan gap might be canceled out by the effects of the excessive efficacy information from the White House briefings. So in other words, the White House may have widened the partisan gap in perceived threat. So this study, to wrap up, this study contributes to the presidential communication by linking the message features from presidential communication with partisans' perceptions and behaviors. This study also extends the EPPM in two ways. In one way, it extends the levels of analysis from just a micro level to incorporate both micro level and macro level. And it also extends the EPPM by considering those self-continuity and asymmetric temporal effects of message features. This study demonstrated how to conduct theory-driven big data research. So specifically, I showed how we scaled up the content coding using machine learning, and also how to do longitudinal analysis using message features and longitudinal surveys. So as I mentioned, my dissertation kind of extends my current research line or my current research program by studying the diffusion of COVID-19 vaccine-related misinformation on Twitter and its impact on public trust and also vaccination behaviors. So for my dissertation, I have two studies. The first study examines the diffusion of the vaccine information across individuals on social media platforms. The second study focuses on the processing and impacts of those diffusion of misinformation on people's behavior, perceptions and vaccination behaviors. So the first study is based on the diffusion of innovation theory. The diffusion of innovation theory predicted that the diffusion of innovations depends on not only attributes of an innovation, but also the network through which the innovation spreads or diffuses. So in the context of online information diffusion, it remains unclear how the message features or the innovation or the attributes of innovations interact with network structures or the properties of the network through which the innovation diffuses, how these two components, like network features and message features, interact with each other to influence diffusion-related outcomes. So the first study of my dissertation exactly examines the interaction, how the interaction between message features and network structures could influence diffusion size, diffusion speed, and structural virality. So all these are diffusion-related outcomes. For the second study, I will examine how the diffusion of information or misinformation will influence offline behavior, perceptions, and behaviors. So there is insufficient evidence using large-scale real-world data on how the diffusion of information about health or health-related topics on social media may affect offline perceptions and behaviors. So my study too will fill this gap by examining the effects of online misinformation diffusion on the offline behaviors, perceptions, and behaviors. And I have other studies along these lines of research. So for example, one study examines the language features of vaccine conversations on Reddit, another social media platform. Another study combines media selection with media processing, using similar approaches as the White House briefing studies that I just talked about, to examine the biases in media selection, media processing, and media effects. So to wrap up, these theory-driven computational approaches contributes to literature and also the industry by providing a network perspective, by connecting online information with offline behaviors, and also by examining dynamic longitudinal message effects. And it will increase the generalizability of academic research in the real world. So looking forward at Texas Tech University, I plan to continue advancing theories in diffusion and processing of health information using state-of-the-art computational methods. I also look forward to contributing my methodological expertise to collaborate with colleagues and also graduate students whose research is in these areas. And also for teaching, I would like to, I would be interested in teaching based on my professional experience in the advertising industry, and also teaching based on the courses I've already taught at Ohio State. And also I could also develop and teach new courses on advanced computational research methods. Okay, that's it. Thank you all for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions you may have.
I have a question about the first study you presented.
Sure.
Could you go to the slide
Yeah.
where you had the networks for Facebook and Twitter?
Yeah.
So those networks were not people networks, right? They were semantic networks?
Are you asking about the audience engagement part?
No, not the audience
Okay.
engagement part, this one.
Yeah.
Because I might ask about that after that's answered.
Yeah. So, okay, so these are, similar news content. So
Right.
is the assumption, because I'm seeing that on Facebook, it looks much more polarized than Twitter.
Yeah.
But it's not, so my first thought of looking at this, I was thinking about it in terms of people, and I was like, oh, maybe Facebook's more polarized, like people are in their own, but it's not, it's the semantic networks.
Right. So
what, is it not the same content then? Because presumably these are news organizations that are sharing content on Facebook and on Twitter.
right.
But they're being shared then by, so I guess I'm trying to like wrap my mind around, like, it's the content that was shared on Facebook and Twitter,
Are there.
but it was selected based on engagement, right? So is it possible then
Selection bias?
that there might be a selection bias between the two, or what do you think is, like, what makes Twitter different than Facebook, or, you know, in these networks where the results are more muddled in Twitter
Yeah.
and clearer in Facebook?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, we got a similar question like this from our reviewers. Yeah, so just to clarify.
I wasn't a reviewer, I can tell you.
Just to clarify, all these nodes are news media, so
Right.
they're not individuals.
Yes, yeah.
And then just exactly like you mentioned, here we see a clear pattern, like a red or reddish color nodes they cluster over here, but then blue or bluish color nodes they cluster over
Right.
there. But then for Twitter, we see a less obvious pattern, right? So a lot of reasons could lead to this different patterns we observe from these two figures. One is, because we're not sure, we just, those are just hypothetical, just some reasons we're thinking about. So one reason could be like Twitter has had a, yeah. So Twitter had a kind of a more rigorous or strict censoring system compared with Facebook, right? So like, for example, former President Trump, his Twitter account was kind of blocked, right? So like Twitter had a more strict censoring system. That's probably part of the reason why we see less polarized cultural network here. That could be one reason. And another reason, just like what you just mentioned, selection bias could be, but then we're not sure. Because like all these nodes, all these news media were selected based on social media engagement. But I could tell you that there is a huge overlap between news organizations on Facebook and
Right.
on Twitter.
That's what I would assume, yeah.
Right. So, yeah, selection bias probably could
But
be the reason.
So in some ways, could this data potentially be some evidence towards saying, hey, Twitter was doing sort of a better job at stopping some of these like cultural polarizations with what they were doing. So Elon Musk, cut it out, right? I mean, of course, I'm not saying that that's what you set out to prove. So it would just be sort of incidental, like, oh, exploratory type stuff. But I mean, to me, it seems like Twitter might be doing a better job of
Right.
breaking apart that polarization.
Right. Right. Yeah, that's part of the selection. Yeah, just exactly like you. But we're not sure. Like
Yeah.
we cannot say for sure because that's not the focus of this study. Like why Facebook
Right,
and
yeah.
Twitter they have totally different patterns of in terms of media ideology. But then that could be part of
Like
the reason.
content that's showing
Yeah.
up on.
Yeah. But selection bias, like our sampling strategy, could also contribute to this.
And I guess too,
patterns.
like, presumably, it's the content that it's being shared by the network. So is it taking into are your maps here taking into consideration when they're being shared by external sources? So are these news networks sharing their content, or could it be content that appears on Facebook or Twitter from a network, but could have been shared by
news media.
just an individual? So are the accounts that are sharing the information? So for example, there's a difference between like if CNN has a Twitter account and posts their content from CNN,
Right.
and
Oh, I
some
see.
other random thing gets shared by a person.
Right.
So the news organization may not have been responsible. So because I'm wondering, like, well, is Facebook possibly having, I don't know, like, are people sharing stuff that's not necessarily the news organization sharing stuff, or is the amount of times it's being shared or commented on, that's counting in terms of your engagement threshold,
Right. Yeah, exactly. So all these accounts are just the official news media
Oh,
account.
just the official. Okay.
Yeah,
That
just
was-
the official news media account. And then those like, other people share like CNN's news or other people share Fox News tweets or whatever. Those are considered as social media engagement.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, I think it's really interesting. I'm just like
Yeah.
really kind of like, oh, how does this work?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
I'll just ask a broader question
Sure.
more about your narrative. So I think it's cool, like, if I understand correctly, you presented 2 studies on unrelated topics, but that each helped you develop part of a process that you want to pull together in your dissertation.
Yeah.
I was just out of like sheer curiosity what that looked like for you. Is it that you were working in these 2 distinct areas and you thought, hey, let's pull all this together? Or did you want to do this big picture and you're like, but first I need to learn the individual parts?
That's a great question. So that's kind of related to my research program, like how it works. Let me go back to, where was this? Let me see. Yeah, here. So actually from this like little program, research program, you can see that diffusion is more from the sociological perspective, like how to use a sociological perspective to analyze communication processes. But then delivery process impacts are more from the psychological perspective, like how those kind of psychological factors or societal factors may influence the delivery processing impacts. So I was trying to kind of combine these two together, like societal level or how to use sociological perspective to study communication, and also how to use psychological perspective to study communication. But then for both approaches or both lines of research, I focus on not like just one news media or one individual or this kind of individual level. I focus more on the, it's not like, it's kind of a scaled up, like not just one individual, but a group of people or millions of people, this large population, and also not just one news media, not just one news article, but also like hundreds of or thousands of news media. So that's kind of my approaches here. Yeah, so these are not just for my dissertation, but also it's my existing research program. Yeah, great question. Yeah.
While you've got that up,
Yeah.
could you speak a little bit about, the thinking about delivery being part of this segment of the study rather than diffusion?
Yeah.
Diffusion. 'Cause it seems like delivery and diffusion ought to be
Yeah,
part
kind of
the same
similar. Yeah, so diffusion here is more on, how should I frame this? So delivery is more about, I would say this one is more about the strategic communication side, like how news media or governments or whoever the organization or the person is strategically frame the messages they want to deliver to the public or to the individuals. So delivery here is more on the psychological side.
Message design.
Right, something like that. But then diffusion is more on like societal level, how the information already being delivered will diffuse across individuals, across news media. So I think those are two different aspects, though they are similar.
But on that societal level diffusion you just mentioned, are you giving any consideration to what the delivery is in that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, actually, for my dissertation, the first study, let me pull up there. So this study actually is about the diffusion of the vaccine information on Twitter. So this study actually considers message features, like how those messages were delivered, and then whether this message features will have some influence on the diffusion outcomes. So yes, for this study, we considered the delivery, the strategic communication part into consideration when I think about the diffusion of information. Yeah. Yeah.
If nobody else has a question. How do you see your plan for like the next 5 years? So going up to tenure, what do you kind of like aim to do big picture? Do you see yourself sort of applying your method or model to different types of questions, or do you see like a bigger question that you're looking at and you're using this model to help, or using these methods to kind of help answer that model? What's your 5-year plan?
Yeah, so let me go back to this slide. Yeah, so for the next 5 or 10 years, I still plan to continue advancing theories in this field, the diffusion and processing of health information using these computational methods. So that's a big overall, like big picture or big plan, like in the next 5 or 10 years, I still plan to do this. But at the same time, like opportunities will open up, right? So it really depends on what kind of positions I can get, and also like faculty members or colleagues I can work with. So I also look forward to those collaboration opportunities and also applying these methods into all this and also more subfields like health, science, communication, information processing, social media, and even corporate and organizational communication as well. So, I mean, overall, this is my main research program, but I also look forward to all the other opportunities.
Do you see yourself applying for a grant project to work on over the next several years?
Yeah, so that's part of my plan because I do I do health communication and also using computational methods. So I plan to eventually in 5 or 10 years probably I will target a R01 grant in NIH. But also starting from that to get started, probably I plan to collaborate with faculty members and also start targeting some internal and external small grants. Yeah, that's part of my plan. Yeah, thank you.
How much is a small grant?
How much?
In your mind, this is just a random question. Yeah, there's no right or wrong answer. I'm just getting in your mind, what makes a small grant versus a big grant?
R03 is kind of.
Well, no, I mean money.
Oh,
Sorry.
money.
How much money would make a small grant versus a big grant?
I don't know. At Ohio State, I'm not sure. For graduate students, we got 5,000 research funding. That's kind of considered a small grant.
So would 100,000 be a big grant or a small grant?
$100?
100,000.
Thousand.
Yeah.
100,000.
$100 would be small.
$100 would be a small grant.
It's a challenge.
Yeah, what do you get $100? But no, I was just curious. This is for my own, I want to go ask a bunch of people what a small grant versus a big grant is. There's no wrong or right answer. I'm not
This
testing
is
you.
in her capacity as the person who helps facilitate.
Yeah, oh yeah. So I'm the interim assistant dean for research, and I
Just for
work with
context.
people. Yeah, I work with the faculty members to help them apply for grants. So in my mind, I'm always curious.
I'd like to know your answer to this question.
Well, that's why I want to know hers. Well, I'll ask hers first because maybe I'm overshooting. So how much would a small grant be for you?
That's a challenging one. So I mean, let's just use my existing studies as an example.
I know, maybe I should do that. Sure. So in my mind, I'm thinking $1 million is a big grant. Yeah.
Yep.
And
Yeah.
everything less than that is a smaller grant. So I would consider 100,000 to 300,000 a smaller grant.
To you?
Yeah. Well, okay. When you look at how the money gets divided, with with $200,000, you can fund a PhD student for a couple years. That's about it. Things get really expensive, right?
I
So.
feel like we can't dichotomize small and
No, we
large.
can't
I feel like
dichotomize it,
when
right?
they
So.
they can't fund anyone.
Yeah, well, and then so a really small grant would be one that where you're just getting some money, but I wouldn't consider that a grant, in my mind. But that's
You just took a grant away from me. We'll do this later.
No, that's no, I mean that's it's an award for doing a research study, but it doesn't. My view does not matter. I was just kind of curious what the expectations from the the students and the new faculty coming in their minds, what is a small grant versus a bigger grant. And when they say, I'm going to apply for small grants, do they mean, I'm going to apply for the public interest communication award, or are they thinking I'm going to apply for a $200,000 to $300,000 grant from NSF or NIH, that the ones that help get you started, which the R01 ones are a couple million or something like this.
Yeah.
So I was just curious. That wasn't supposed to be a challenging or
No, that's
I'm
totally
not
fine.
saying that there's a right answer. I was just curious what your perspective
Since
is.
we're almost out of
I'm
time.
sorry, I'll shut
No,
up.
it's all right. Perhaps I'll help answer this. Is that all right?
Sure.
So, this last year I applied for 2 grants. One was $30 million, and one was $67,000. I got the $67,000 one. Didn't get the $30 million one.
That's fair.
So $67,000 to me is a big one.
There you go.
I think we need more categories.
It's all relative.
That's all right.
We need more 30, I would call that excessive instead of large.
Oh yeah, 30 million. I mean, that's that's starting your own business.
Well, thank you
Yeah.
for being
Yeah,
here.
thank you. Sorry.
Thank you, everyone.